This is the seventh in a series of programs I'm doing on human nature and what famous thinkers in philosophy, psychology, literature, religion, and science have said about it. Today's program will focus on the question, can anything significant be done to get human beings to treat each other more decently? Many thinkers over the centuries have addressed themselves to the dark side of human nature. The Buddha, for example, claimed that hatred, greed, envy, selfishness come easily to us. And Jesus leaves us with the impression that we are all sinners. Indeed, many Christians believe in the concept of original sin. According to many Christians who espouse this idea, they believe that as a consequence of Adam and Eve's sin, we all inherit the stain of their sin, and as a consequence, we have a predisposition to evil. And therefore, we human beings, according to this idea, must work at being virtuous, that being decent doesn't come easily to us. There is a long history of famous thinkers who had a rather negative view of human nature. Plato did not believe in democracy. Why so? Well, Plato believed that the majority of people usually don't exhibit good judgment. Aristotle, like Plato, had a rather negative view of human nature. Aristotle said that the average human being is closer to the beast than to the god. He went on to say that the great majority of people are natural dunces and sluggards. Aristotle also commented about the utopians of the period when he lived. These were people who attributed evil in human beings to the possession of private property. Today, perhaps we would call these people communists. Well, Aristotle disputed their notion that evil in some way or another was directly connected to the possession of private property. Aristotle said no. He said the origin of evil, and I'm quoting Aristotle, is the wickedness of human nature itself. St. Augustine, again one of the most famous of Catholic saints, espoused the idea of original sin, and in his autobiography entitled The Confessions of St. Augustine, he talked about some of the questionably moral things he did when he was young. Indeed, he claims that so many of the things he did when he was a young man were actually evil. And among the specific things he talks about was his propensity for stealing pears from a neighbor's pear tree. And the point he makes is that he didn't need to steal the pears. He could have gotten pears from his father's pear trees, free of charge. But he experienced a certain thrill in stealing, a certain thrill in doing evil. And St. Augustine believed it's not unusual among human beings that they experience a kind of thrill in doing evil. The 17th century philosopher Thomas Hobbes, in his very famous book entitled Leviathan, presents a very pessimistic view of human nature. Thomas Hobbes believed that human beings are instinctively ruthless and selfish, and any attempt to make them moral beings is a waste of time. Carl Jung, the famous 20th century psychiatrist, whom I often allude to in my programs, he said this about human nature, and I'm quoting Jung: "Evil, without man's ever having chosen it, is lodged in human nature itself." And Sigmund Freud, in his famous book entitled Civilization and Its Discontents, said this about human nature, and I'm quoting Freud: "Men are not gentle creatures. On the contrary, they are creatures among whose instinctual endowments is to be reckoned a large share of aggressiveness. He then went on to say that man is a wolf to man. Man is a wolf to man. Marcel Proust, arguably the most famous and best French novelist of the 20th century, said this: "I feel infinite sadness at seeing how few human beings are genuinely kind." Proust then went on to comment that he believed that most people had something rather wrong with them. Montaigne, the very famous French intellectual of the 16th century, claimed that 14 out of 15 people are rogues. Jefferson, who was a scholar himself and who was very well acquainted with the writings of Montaigne, was asked what he thought about Montaigne's opinion. And Jefferson responded in this way. He said, I think Montaigne is off base. I think you'll find more than one good person in a group of 15. But he went on to say that if one is talking about people who have managed to contrive to nestle themselves into positions of power and profit, well then maybe Montaigne's comment was right on target, at least for that group of people. Richard Hofstadter, who taught history at Columbia University for many years and who was a Jefferson scholar, claimed that Jefferson was more suspicious of the upper classes than the lower classes, that Jefferson believed the upper classes were more disposed to evil than were the lower classes. Henry Adams was a professor who taught at Harvard in the late 19th and early 20th centuries and became quite famous for his autobiography entitled The Education of Henry Adams. Professor Adams said this: "Average human nature is very coarse." And he ended his autobiography with this comment. He said that he wished that someday the world would be such that sensitive and timid people could live in it without shuddering. Steven Pinker is a very famous professor at MIT, very famous contemporary professor at MIT, who has done a lot of research concerning the human genome. And Pinker claims that his research shows that human beings, by nature, biologically, in other words, are wired for aggressiveness. Indeed, Professor Pinker claims that because of our biology, ethnic hatreds are easy to arouse, ethnic hatreds can be easily aroused. But I must also mention that Harvard Professor Emeritus E.O. Wilson, who has also done much research on the human genome, while he agrees with Professor Pinker that we human beings may be biologically wired for aggression, Professor Wilson goes on to say that he also believes we are wired for altruism, that he says we cannot overlook how complicated we are. Again, possibly having an instinct or a genetic predisposition, he would say, a genetic predisposition for aggression, but also a genetic predisposition for altruism. Carl Jung, in commenting on how complicated we are, said this, and I'm quoting Carl Jung: "The self is a union of opposites. The individual is confronted with the abysmal contradictions of human nature. For in the self, good and evil are indeed closer than identical twins." You recall that Freud said that man is a wolf to man, that human beings are innately aggressive. Well, history does provide much evidence to back up Freud's view. We know, for example, that slavery existed in almost every area of the world at one time or another. Indeed, in the book of Leviticus in the Old Testament, chapter 25, the book of Leviticus condones slavery. And the book of Exodus, also in the Old Testament, in chapter 21, condones selling one's daughter into slavery. And we know that so many European countries in the 18th and 19th centuries very much cooperated in the slave trade and made much money in the slave trade, transporting slaves from Africa to the Americas. And of course, we know that the United States, by 1861, the year in which the Civil War started, the United States had approximately 4 million slaves by that time. History, besides telling us about slavery and how popular it has been in history, also points out that imperialism and wars of conquest have been commonplace. The ancient Romans conquered much of Europe, part of Africa, and a good deal of the Middle East. And Spain, in the 15th and 16th centuries, embarked on an imperialistic program. Columbus and the other conquistadors conquered for Spain so much of Latin America. And we know that the Spanish often treated the Indians brutally. Indeed, some historians refer to what the Spanish did to the Indians as genocide. More recently, we know that in the 20th century, Nazi Germany under Hitler conquered approximately 10 countries. And of course, we also know that the Nazis were responsible for the Holocaust, in which approximately 6 million Jews perished. The United States has not been above being imperialistic. In 1898, the United States acquired Hawaii, Guam, and the Philippines, and we did not ask any of those people if they wanted to be ruled by us. And prior to that, the United States in the 1840s fought Mexico in a war, and as a result of that war, the United States acquired California and what is now New Mexico and Arizona and some other areas of the West. And many historians claim the United States had no justification for going to war against Mexico, and that our president's main reason, our president at the time was James Polk, that his real reason involved an ulterior motive, and that is a grab for Mexican land. Indeed, Abraham Lincoln, who was a member of Congress at the time of the Mexican War, believed that the United States was engaged in evil doing, that we really had no right to go to war against Mexico. Besides slavery, imperialism, wars of conquest, history also gives evidence of much religious intolerance. We know that the Catholic Inquisition was instituted in Spain and Italy during the Middle Ages. We know that the Catholic Church condoned the burning of religious heretics. We also know that England in 1290 and Spain in 1492 expelled Jewish people from their countries. Indeed, the Jews were generally given one of two choices: become Christians or leave. And we know that in the 16th and 17th centuries, much of Europe was involved in religious wars. In Germany and France, for example, there were wars between Catholics and Protestants, Catholics killing Protestants, Protestants killing Catholics. Again, a real absence of religious tolerance. And we know that in Shakespeare's England, the government of England banned Catholicism. Indeed, it made being a Catholic priest an act of treason. So that by the time of Shakespeare, by the time he was writing his plays, England had effectively banished Catholics and Jews from its country. Indeed, Stephen Greenblatt, a professor at Harvard who is a Shakespearean scholar, claims it's quite possible that Shakespeare never met a Jew because, again, the English had banished the Jews from England. It is interesting that Jesus taught that people should love their neighbors, and indeed, Jesus taught that people should love their enemies. Some pundits claim that there are few instances in history of Christians loving their enemies. What do you think? And we know that religious intolerance has not been confined to Christians. We know that India, for example, has had a history of religious intolerance, of the majority Hindus often persecuting the minority Muslims. And we know that in Iraq today, there are problems, religious-based problems, between the Muslim Shiites and the Muslim Sunnis. And of course, the 20th century has also seen much religious intolerance in Northern Ireland, so that Catholics and Protestants have come into much conflict, again, in Northern Ireland. And of course, besides religious intolerance and persecution, history gives much evidence of humiliation of other people by certain countries by segregating them. We know that South Africa is an illustration of this, that the whites in South Africa imposed segregation on black people by law and imposed humiliating restrictions on black people and left black people no peaceful recourse to protest because the white government of South Africa banned even peaceful protests. And we know in India there has been discrimination based on social class. Again, not race, but rather social class. That large group of people in India, constituting many millions of people, are referred to as untouchables. And this group of people in India has traditionally been subject to all kinds of discrimination: job discrimination, housing discrimination, marriage discrimination. I must point out, in recent years, some efforts have been made in India to reduce, if not eliminate, discrimination against these people, again called untouchables. Mahatma Gandhi was very upset by this kind of discrimination against his fellow Indians, and Gandhi said this about people humiliating other people, and I'm quoting Gandhi: "It has always been a mystery to me how people can feel themselves honored by humiliating their fellow human beings." And of course, the United States has not been above this. After the Civil War, the South reacted to its loss in the Civil War by imposing segregation on black people by law, so that blacks and whites were segregated in schools, in restaurants, in theaters, in parks, in beaches, even in churches. Indeed, Martin Luther King said that the most segregated hour in America, again, this is years ago, was 10 a.m. on a Sunday, when whites went to their Christian churches and blacks went to their Christian churches. And many white congregations very much resisted any black people becoming part of their congregations. And of course, we know that lynchings of black people were not uncommon in the South. Historians tell us that approximately, or I should say at least 3,000 black people were lynched. No trial, no jury, and virtually all of the murderers were never punished, indeed never even brought to trial for murdering other people. And of course, perhaps the worst part of racism, whether it was in Africa or America or any other country, is that people were conditioned to feel inferior. The idea was that people were to be kept in their place, so to speak. Psychoanalyst Alfred Adler presents some illuminating comment, I think, on why some groups of people have insisted on humiliating other groups of people. Adler said this, and again I'm quoting psychiatrist Alfred Adler. The goal of superiority, of power, of the conquest of others, is the goal which directs the activity of most human beings. We know that the southern part of the United States, after the Civil War, not only imposed racial segregation on black people, but also devised all kinds of gimmicks to prevent them from voting. There is a certain irony in the fact that the southern part of the United States, through slavery and racial segregation, violated so many of Jesus' precepts. And yet today, the southern part of the United States is considered to be a bastion of Christianity, and some people consider it to be the heart of the Bible Belt. We also know, in talking about the dark side of human nature, that the treatment of women over the centuries by men gives ample testimony to the aggressiveness of men. We know that women in almost all areas of the world were expected to be subservient to men. Indeed, it wasn't until the 20th century that women in the United States and Great Britain got the right to vote. Maybe it was his knowledge of such things that prompted writer John Paul Sartre to say this: hell is other people. And scientist Carl Sagan spoke of the reptilian core in human beings, and he said the reptilian core is that kernel of savagery in the brain left untouched by the process of evolution. And Carl Jung put it this way, and I'm quoting him: we are always, thanks to our human nature, potential criminals. Remember the question for today: can anything significant be done to get people to behave more decently towards other people? Well, I think there may be some hope, some cause for hope. I mentioned in previous programs that our salvation may lie in our complexity. Blaise Pascal, very famous Catholic philosopher, said there are two natures in us, the one bad, the other good. And the Dalai Lama has said that while we may have an instinct for aggression, we may also have an instinct for compassion. And again, Carl Jung, in talking about how complicated we are, said this: the self is a union of opposites. The individual is confronted with the abysmal contradictions of human nature. For in the individual, good and evil are indeed closer than identical twins. It is encouraging and a source of hope that the human race has produced a St. Francis of Assisi, a Gandhi, a Martin Luther King Jr., a Mother Teresa, an Albert Schweitzer, political dissidents in many countries of the world fighting for democracy, willing to risk their lives to bring democracy to their countries. And we know there are armies, literally armies of volunteers in so many of the most poverty-stricken countries in the world. People trying to help poor people to achieve a better standard of living. Also, history teaches us that the world today is better in many significant ways. The 20th century witnessed a great expansion of democracy. For example, South Africa, the country I alluded to earlier in the program, the country that had imposed a brutal system of racial segregation on black people, is today a democracy. Indeed, the last two presidents of South Africa have been black men. And of course, the 20th century saw democracy come to many Eastern European countries after the breakdown of the Soviet Union. And many countries in Latin America are now democratic. And of course, the United States in the 20th century became far more democratic, in that the U.S. witnessed the end of racial segregation imposed by law and the end of legal gimmicks to prevent black people from voting. So that today, in the 20th century, in many areas of the world, women, black people, and gays are being treated far more fairly than they used to be treated. Also, we know that the 20th century and the 21st century give much evidence of human intelligence being responsible for significant improvements in healthcare and life expectancy. Indeed, the life expectancy in so many countries of the world has been dramatically increased. Did you know that in Japan now, the life expectancy of Japanese women is 84? Also, human intelligence has been responsible for remarkable improvements in so many kinds of technology. In fact, improvements in technology have been nothing short of amazing. If only the intelligence of the human species could be as effective in promoting peace and justice in the world as it has been in advancing technology, what a different kind of world this would be. Martin Luther King Jr. claimed, "We really have only two choices." Martin Luther King Jr. said this: "Either we shall learn to live together as brothers and sisters, or we shall perish together as fools." As usual, I'd like to end with a quote from Henry David Thoreau. Thoreau in Walden reminds us that we are all artists. He penned the following words: "To affect the quality of the day, that is the highest of arts."